The Chrysalids, Chapter 10, Part 2. I could not even discuss Uncle Axel's solution with the others for fear that Anne might catch our thoughts, but I knew with certainty what their verdict would be. I knew that Uncle Axel had proposed the only practical solution, and I knew, too, that its impossibility meant recognizing the fact that nothing could be done. Anne now transmitted nothing whatsoever. We caught no trace of her, but whether she had the strength of will not to receive we were still uncertain. And from Rachel, her sister, we learned that she would listen only to words, and was doing her best to pretend to herself that she was a norm in every way. But that could not give us enough confidence for us to exchange our thoughts with freedom. And in the following weeks, Anne kept it up so perfectly, so that one could almost believe that she had succeeded in renouncing her differences and had become a norm. Her wedding day arrived with nothing amiss, and she and Alan moved into the house that her father gave them on the edge of his own farmland. And here and there, one would encounter hints that she might have been unwise to marry Alan, but otherwise there was little comment. And during the next few months, we scarcely heard anything of her. She discouraged visits from her sister as though she were anxious to even cut that last link with us, and we could only hope that she was being more successful and happier than we feared. One of the consequences, as far as Rosalind and I were concerned, was a more searching consideration of our own troubles. Quite when it was that we had known we were going to marry one another, neither of us had been able to remember. It was just one of those things that just seemed to be, in such proper accord with the law of nature and our own desire, that we felt we had always known it. The prospect colored our thoughts even before we acknowledged it to ourselves or each other. And to me, it had never been thinkable that anything else could happen. For when two people have grown up thinking together as closely as we had, and when they are drawn even closer together by the knowledge of the hostility all around them, they can feel the need of one another before they even know they are in love. But when they do know they are in love, they suddenly know that there are ways in which they differ not at all from normals. Also, they face the same obstacles that norms would. And the feud between our families, which had first come into the open regarding the matter of the great horses, had now been established for years. My father and my half-uncle Angus, Rosalind's father, had settled down to a regular guerrilla war, and in their efforts to score points, each kept a hawk-like watch upon the other's farms for the least deviation or offense, which both had been known for some time now to reward any informer who would bring news of irregularities from the other's territory. And my father, in his determination to maintain a higher level of purity than Angus, had made considerable personal sacrifice. He had, for instance, in spite of his great love for tomatoes, had completely given up growing the unstable tomato family at all. We bought our tomatoes now, and our potatoes. Certain other species, too, were blacklisted as unreliable at some inconvenience and expense. And although it was a state of affairs which promoted high normality rates on both farms, it did nothing whatsoever to make for good neighborliness. It was perfectly clear that neither side would be anything but dead set against a union of our families. For both of us, the situation was bound to grow more difficult. Already, Rosalind's mother had attempted some matchmaking, and I had seen my mother measuring one or two other girls with a calculating, yet so far unsatisfied eye. We were sure that, at present, neither side had any idea of anything between us. There was no more than acrid communication between the Storms and the Mortons, and the only place where they could be found beneath the same roof was church. Therefore, Rosalind and I met infrequently and very discreetly. And at the present, this was an impasse, and it looked like an impasse of indefinite duration, unless we could do something to force the situation. There was a possible way, and could we have been sure that Angus's wrath would have taken the form of forcing a shotgun wedding upon us, we would have taken it, but we were no means certain about it. Such was his opposition to all storms, that there was, we considered, a strong likelihood that he might be prompted to use his shotgun another way. However, we were sure that even if honor were forcibly preserved, We should both of us be disowned by our own families shortly thereafter. We discussed and explored at length for some peaceful way out of this dilemma, but even when half a year passed since Anne's marriage, we were no closer to reaching it. As for the rest of our group, we found that in the 6 months since the first alarm, we had lost our edge. That is not to say that we were easy in our minds. We had never been so since we discovered ourselves, but we had had to get used to living with a degree of threat, and once the crisis regarding Anne seemed to have passed, we got used to living with a slightly increased degree of threat. But then, one Sunday at dusk, Alan was found dead in the path that led to his home, with an arrow through his neck. We heard the news first from Rachel, and we listened anxiously as she tried to make contact with her sister. She used all of her concentration, but it was useless. Anne's mind remained as firmly closed against us as it had been for the last 8 months. Even in her distress, she transmitted nothing. "I'm going over to see her," Rachel told us. "She needs to have me by her side." And we waited expectantly for an hour or more, and then Rachel came through again, very upset. "She won't see me. She won't let me into the house. She let a neighbor in, but not me. She screamed at me to go away." "She must think one of us did it," came Michael's response. "Did any of you do it, or know anything about this?" And our denials came in, emphatically, one after another. "We've got to stop her thinking that," Michael decided. "She can't go on believing it. Try to get through to her." And we all tried, but there was no response whatever. "It's no good," Michael admitted. "We have to get a note to her somehow, Rachel," he added. "Word it carefully, so that she'll understand that we had nothing to do with this, but so that the note wouldn't mean anything to anyone else." "Very well, I'll try," Rachel agreed doubtfully. And another hour passed before we heard from her once more. "It's no good. I gave the note to the woman who's there and waited. And when the woman came back, she said Anne just tore it up without opening it. My mother's in there now, trying to persuade her to come back to our house." Michael was slow in replying to that, and then he advised, "Well, we all need to be prepared. All of you. Be ready to run for it if necessary, but don't rouse any suspicion. Rachel, keep on trying to find out what you can and fill us in if anything happens." I did not know what to do for the best. Petra was already in her bed, and I could not wake her without it being noticed. Besides, I wasn't even sure it was necessary. She certainly could not be suspected, even by Anne, of having had any part in the killing of Alan. It was only potentially that she could be considered one of us at all, so I made no move beyond sketching a rough plan in my mind, and trusted I should have enough warning to get us both clear. The house had retired for the night before Rachel came through again. "We're going home, Mother and I," she told us. "Anne has kicked everyone out, and she's alone there now. Mother wanted to stay, but Anne is beside herself and hysterical. She made them go. They were afraid she'd be worse if they insisted on staying, and she's told Mother she knows who's responsible for Alan's death, but she wouldn't name anyone." "Do you really think she means us? After all, it is possible that Alan may have had other quarrels of his own that we know nothing about," Michael suggested. But Rachel was dubious. "If it were only that, she'd certainly have let me in. She wouldn't have screamed at me to go away," she pointed out. "I'll go over early in the morning, see if she's changed her mind." And with that, we had to be content for the moment. We could relax very little, for a few hours at least. Rachel told us later what happened the following morning. She had woken an hour after dawn and made her way across the fields to Anne's house, and when she reached it, she hesitated, reluctant to face the possibility of the same sort of screaming that she had suffered the previous day. However, it was simply useless to stand there, looking at the house, so she plucked her courage and knocked. And the sound of it echoed inside, and she waited, and there was no result. She tried again, more decisively, but still no one answered. Rachel became alarmed. She hammered vigorously on the door and stood listening. Then slowly and apprehensively, she lowered her hand and went to the house of the neighbor who had been with Anne the previous day. With one of the logs from the woodpile, they smashed in a window and then climbed inside. And they found Anne upstairs in her bedroom, hanging from a beam. They lifted her down between them and laid her on her bed, but they were too late by hours to be of any help to her, and the neighbor covered her with a blanket. And for Rachel, it was all unreal. She was dazed. The neighbor took her by the arm to lead her out, and as they were leaving, she noticed a folded sheet of paper lying on the table, and she picked it up. "Oh, this will be for you or maybe your parents," she said, putting the envelope in Rachel's hand. Rachel looked at it, dully, reading the inscription on the outside. "Oh, it's not," she began automatically, but then she checked herself and pretended to study it more closely, as it then occurred to her that the neighbor woman could not read. "Oh, right, I see. Yes, I'll give it to my parents," she said, and slipped it into her dress, the message that was addressed neither to herself nor to her parents, but to the inspector. The neighbor's husband drove her home in the carriage, and she broke the news to her parents. And that night, alone in her bedroom, the one that Anne had shared with her before she had married, Rachel read the letter. It denounced all of us, including Rachel herself, and even little Petra. It accused us collectively of planning Alan's murder, and one of us, unspecified, of carrying it out. Rachel read it carefully twice, and then burnt it. The tension eased for the rest of us after a day or two. Anne's suicide was a tragedy, but no one saw any mystery about it. A young wife, pregnant with her first child, thrown off her mental balance by the shock of losing her husband. Under such circumstances, it was a sad result, but understandable. But it was Alan's death that remained unattributable to anyone, and as much of a mystery to us as to the rest. Inquiries had revealed several persons who held a grudge against him, but none with a strong enough motive for murder, nor any likely suspect who could not convincingly account for himself at the time when Alan must have been killed. Old William Tay acknowledged the arrow to be one of his making, but then again, almost all the arrows in our district were so. It was not a competition arrow or identifiable in any way. It was just a plain, everyday hunting arrow, such as might be found by the dozen in anyone's home. People gossiped, of course, and speculated, and from somewhere came the rumor that Anne was less devoted to her husband than had been supposed, and that for the last few weeks she seemed to have grown afraid of him. And to the great distress of her parents, it grew into a rumor that Anne herself had let fly the arrow, and then committed suicide out of remorse or the fear of being found out. But that too died away when, again, no sufficiently strong motive could be discovered. In a few weeks, speculation found other topics, and the mystery was written off as unsolvable. It might even have been an accident, which the culprit dared not acknowledge. We had kept our ears wide open for any hint of guesswork or supposition that may lead attention towards us, but there was none at all, and as the interest declined, we were able to relax. But although we felt less anxiety than we had at any time for nearly a year, the underlying effect remained, the sense of warning, with a sharpened awareness that we were set apart, with the safety of all of us lying in the hands of each other. We grieved for Anne, but the grief was made less sharp by the feeling that we had already lost her some time before, and it was only Michael who did not seem to share in the lightning of worry. He said, "One of us has not been found strong enough."